Hi everybody, I'm Bill Whittle. Well, imagine you're a fine, upstanding, middle-class American citizen and suddenly you're finding yourself behind bars at a real detention facility. You're about to find out what that would be like. You're watching PJTV's three-part in-depth discussion with Dinesh D'Souza, best-selling author and academic whose anti-Obama movie, 2016, is the second most popular political documentary of all time. Dinesh, thanks very much for being here. Thanks for joining us. You know, in the last segment, we talked about elements in your book in Stealing America, about what the trial was like and the selective prosecution that you experienced and what some other people had gotten in terms of much smaller sentences for much larger offenses. But in this segment, I'd like to concentrate a little bit about your experience actually in this detention center. You were assigned to a detention center in San Diego, which required you to stay overnight. I think most people, when they heard about this outrage, told themselves, well, at least he's going to, he's going to some white-collar prison spa and he'll be surrounded by doctors and attorneys and, it won't be as bad as all that. But that's not where you ended up, is it?
Well, actually, the opposite was true. On the day of my sentencing, I was kind of jubilant because I had beaten the Obama administration's effort to send me to 10 to 16 months of federal prison. And I had gotten this confinement center business instead, which struck me as some kind of a community service center. But no, turns out that in federal white-collar prison, that's when you meet the mayor and the corporate executive and the doctor who defrauded Medicare, and you play Scrabble, and they have an activities director, and the food can be pretty good. Not here. This was a confinement center on the Mexican border. And it was for the whole gamut of criminals. In other words, if you went to prison and you did 10 years for armed robbery or drug smuggling, and then you would come to the end of your term and you're making your way back to society, well, you get 90 days in the confinement center before you're set free. So this was a rough group of hoodlums, 120 of us sleeping on 2 levels in open dormitories on bunk beds. And over 8 months, I got to know these guys pretty well. In the beginning, I was terrified. And I must say, I was a hermit. I spoke to nobody. I felt that there might be some gang stuff going on. I didn't want to get in the middle of that. So for my own safety, I stayed to myself. But after a while, I decided to make this a learning opportunity.
And these were murderers in there, people who, whether they'd been convicted of it or not, certainly people who admitted they'd committed murders. This is a rough crowd.
A rough crowd. There was one guy, he was kind of a white supremacist with all this stuff on his back, and he said that he had been falsely charged with attempted murder when all he had done was stand by the door and watch. And I thought, boy, anyone who can watch a murder taking place is not the kind of guy I want to actually be in close quarters with.
You actually report that you took there's a program that was offered you and that you were required to take, I assume, in this facility, and it basically was talking about prison rape, and it said that you have a right not to be raped. That must have been very, very reassuring for you to know.
This is one of the first things that happened to me. As I went through, they said, well, you got to take a class. And I'm like, a class? And I thought it might be something, that'd be typical, an English class for people who can't speak English, job training. But this class was called PREA, Prevention of Rape. And I was like, whoa, is that a problem in the confinement center? It turns out that they give you a lot of idiotic slogans like you have a right not to be raped, or the Obama administration has a zero-tolerance policy.
This is what I'm talking about.
Toward rape. And I'm like, what was the policy before?
Yeah.
Anyway, happily, I think ironically, sleeping in an open dorm without having cells was a protection, because it's much harder to do anything when you're in the open zone like that.
And since you had to be there in the evening and you could get out in the early morning, you basically slept during your day and got a chance to stay awake most of the night. I'd be sleeping with one eye open, certainly.
I did that. I slept with one eye open the first week, but to be honest with you, the rest of the time I slept okay. In fact, I became almost a little expert in the sort of politics of the confinement center. I got a quiet bunk in the corner, bottom level, out of the noise, and I was able to sleep okay.
Well, what's fascinating about this aspect of your book, Stealing America, is the sense that is just the entire experience with this hardened prisoner population. We're talking about people who are not out there in the political scenes. They're not on Bill O'Reilly, and they're committing hard crimes, and they're paying for it. And one of the things that I found so interesting, and in a weird sort of way, I don't know if this was your experience, if somehow very refreshing, was twofold about this prison population. One, they seemed to have their own internal morality. It may have been a severe and brutal morality, but there was one. And especially, secondly, there seemed to be just a complete and utter disregard for this kind of institutionalized nonsense, like you have a right not to be raped or anything else. Can we start with that second one first?
Sure.
What was the attitude that you picked up from these prisoners towards this sort of officiousness that gets pushed down from the top onto this population?
Well, the first thing I noticed was that the inmates were very shameless. They had an attitude of the whole system of giving them the middle finger. They were always looking for ways to sort of scam the system. And I thought, well, that's natural because you guys are criminals. You're going to try to beat the system. But then I realized that behind this is a point of view that's worth considering. Their point of view is that we're offenders, but we're the small fry. That the big fry are still at large. The big fry, in fact, are never pursued by the system because they're running the system. So from the criminal's point of view, the prison system itself is also a racket. And it's a money-making racket. It's a racket that will have classes where no one goes. They'll insist that prisoners get their GED because they get money for each prisoner that gets his GED. And so what's going on really here is that the prison system is making money off the prisoners and ripping off the American taxpayer. And the criminals have not a complex, but a vague sense that this is going on, and they rebel against it. So they're shameless, and I found, having looked at my own case and the inequities and disproportionalities involved in it, I was kind of shameless like them. We had a kind of common shamelessness toward the system, and part of this book is an investigation of the authenticity of that emotion and whether or not the criminal's insight is true, that the big criminals are still at large.
Regardless of the crime, whether it's a confidence game crime or any other crime, the life of a criminal is a life pretty much of constant lying and a life of constant gaming the system and knowing what to say when and so on. And you mentioned in the book that you found that you would assume that these people who were, in many cases, I don't know what other word to call them, basically gutter prisoners. These are not, as we said earlier, they're not extortionists and they're not, criminal masterminds. These are street criminals in detention in southern San Diego. But you said they were actually much smarter than the people working in the system, that the criminals you found were far brighter and far more industrious than the people who were actually in the prison as guards and administrators.
I think on average that is true. And in fact, it's not surprising because as one guy put it to me who was basically a thief, he goes, stealing is hard work. He goes, and besides, it's a job. If you're a thief, you have to steal every day.
That's right.
And think about how hard that is, how hard it is every day to relieve people of their property without them being aware of it or with you being able to get away with it. The risk level is high. So the guy working in the confinement center is a completely different animal. Usually that's a guy who is following a formula, following a set of rules, almost robotically, almost mindlessly, in which the satisfaction is not even financial. They're not doing it for the money. They're not even very well paid. But there's a psychic satisfaction. The psychic satisfaction is for being able to tell people what to do. Mm-hmm. And that is part of the perverse, I would call it the cruelty of bureaucracy, where bureaucrats basically get to order people around. You'll see a young Hispanic woman in her mid-20s being able to tell hardened criminals, do this, get over there, and literally lecture them like a school teacher. Why? Because she has power and they don't. It's not that they have 10% of the power and she has 90. She has 100% of the power and they have 0.
Let me ask you this. The other half of this was a sense that you developed that there was an honor code within criminals, that while so much of what they did broke society's norms, they had their own norms which were rigorously enforced, and things like their reaction to childhood rapists or something while in prison and so on. And I'm just curious, you had a lot of time to think in there, did it ever strike you that these American criminals on some level had a higher sense of integrity than the people that had prosecuted you, all the while claiming, no, this is a routine inspection, no, we're not singling you out, no, it has nothing to do with the movie, no. You were talking just a moment ago about this sort of set of bureaucratic rigidity and lies that you were presented with during your trial. Did you find something admirable about these prisoners in terms of, you talked about how open they were and how unafraid they were to speak the truth. Was that part of that equation? Yeah, in fact, to me, it was almost reminiscent of, say, watching The Godfather. You have a guy like Luca Brasi, a really bad guy, but there's a certain kind of clarity with what he's doing. He's a bad guy. He knows he's a bad guy. If he comes to a bad end, in a certain sense, he knows that's just. Luca Brasi never tried to wear a halo. I think this is what distinguishes him from the progressives. That's right. There's no assumed moral superiority. He knows he's a criminal. He understands how the game works, and he's prepared to do the time, and he's prepared to take the risk, and he's not covering himself in laurels for what he's doing. He knows he's robbing people. Take a confidence man who pulls off a kind of confidence trick. He may take a certain pleasure in having gotten away with it, but now compare him to Obama. Obama goes to young people and he goes, listen, I'm going to give you free college.
Young guys go, that's fantastic. What does Obama do? He says, okay, well, the government's going to pay for it. And since the government doesn't have any money, they're going to be adding to the national debt. Who's going to pay the national debt? Young people.
Right.
So what Obama's doing is reaching into your back pocket, taking money out of your own future earnings, giving it back to you, and pretending like he's a marvelous philanthropist. So this is a confidence operation by Obama, but Obama genuinely thinks, or makes us believe, that he's doing an act of wonderful moral virtue. This is what makes the whole thing so repulsive. It's one thing to be a con man, it's another thing to be a con man pretending to be a priest.
Precisely, and the narcissism of him and Hillary as well, and so many of the progressives is, we are stealing from you, and you are not only going to accept it, you're going to tell us how much you love us and how much you admire us and how kind and decent we are.
Exactly. You're not just robbing Peter to pay Paul, you're robbing Paul to pay Paul.
That's exactly right. So the main thrust of your book, which we're going to get to in the next segment, is the idea that progressive politics, or really even any sense of what has happened to the money in this country over the last 30 or 40 years in general, but specifically progressive politics, it's a heist, it's a scam, it's theft on a gigantic scale. We'll get into the details of that in the next segment. But what was it about the people that you met? What was it about these street criminals that opened your eyes to big politics in a way that hadn't been opened before?
One of these guys was talking to me about these scams, and he made the point that the big criminals are out there. And initially I was kind of skeptical. Obviously a criminal's going to say that. I was reminded of an anecdote in Augustine's City of God. He talks about Alexander the Great and the pirate. Well, Alexander the Great hears about this pirate who's raiding the seas and boarding ships, so he calls the pirate, and he says, where do you get this crazy idea of raiding ships? And the pirate goes, I got it from you. And the pirate then says, I have one boat, and so I'm a pirate. You have a whole navy and a whole army, and you do all these conquests, but you're called the great emperor. And then Augustine says that basically gangs are kingdoms on a small scale, and kingdoms, he's referring to the Roman Empire, are gangs on a large scale. So I began to now think, is there something to this? Is there a way in which, here I am, an intellectual, I tended to understand American politics as some kind of a debate, an intellectual skirmish.
That's right. The founders holding their parchments and a free exchange of ideas, and
yes.
and the best idea wins. And if we're outvoted, well, the majority has spoken. We have to conform. But it's not like that at all anymore.
The criminals taught me that human nature is driven by avarice, lust, envy, revenge, the relentless pursuit of power. I think that's a very useful lens with which to look at modern progressivism. It tends to remove the wool from your eyes.
Yeah, avarice, lust, envy, revenge, will to power. It sounds like the last Democratic debate. I mean, you put one of those in front of each one of the podiums, you got everybody covered. That's going to do it for segment 2, but you can check out the other parts of this amazing 3-part series at PJTV. And don't forget to buy Dinesh D'Souza's remarkable book called Stealing America. It's really quite extraordinary. I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in segment 3.